I don't even know what those clumps are. I am not sticking my hand in that. For my eagle-eyed audience, those cables are actually supposed to be black, not grey. So clearly there's something very wrong here. And I didn't realise you get clumps of dust like this on the bottom of the PC. Now there's a new thing where you get dust shadows on top of your desktop, which is interesting. And also the top of that PSU is supposed to be black, not grey. Now I think I figured out what happened to this PC. I think this PC started to overheat and he started a new business by cremating small animals inside of his PC. Now going back to the past before this PC was even opened, I originally bought this PC for £50 off Facebook Marketplace and it was sight unseen. I had no idea what I was getting, and I'm essentially going to see if I can take this apart, fix it and turn it for a profit by selling all the parts. Now this PC was originally an Antec design case which looked pretty decent from the pictures, and all I got to see was some of the front of the case and also the back of the case also. Now trying to turn this PC on, of course the LED just came on for a split second and switched off, and looking around the back of the case, the I/O on that motherboard looks pretty interesting, and also there seems to be multiple GPUs inside this PC as well. The thing I didn't notice, and I noticed when I went back up, was this little switch for the fans to reduce and increase the speed, which I've never seen before coming out of the side of a case. Now when I opened this up, I then started taking the I/O cooler off and loosening one of the screws. That hose was completely covered in dust, and I'm guessing this must be an ex-smoker's PC. So if you haven't seen a smoker PC before, well, this is what it looks like. Now when I pulled that cooler off, I still couldn't see what kind of CPU that was in there, and even when I tried and cleaned it up, it still wasn't very clear. So I'm going to pull the motherboard out and I'm going to clean it properly and get a better look. Thought let me access the RAM sticks and just see what kind of RAM I'm dealing with here. Initially I got excited, I thought it was 32 gigs of RAM, but actually no, it's 4x4 gigs of DDR3, so making a total of 16 gigs of RAM, which is still pretty good for 4 sticks. Now looking at the GPUs, and this was a bit of a disappointment. 1X PCIe GT 1030 1GB DDR3 graphics card, which is absolutely shockingly terrible, and you can see the I/O cooler is completely caked in dust. I've never seen anything like that before in my life. You could scrape it off with a knife and put it on your toast as butter. So once I got the diseased I/O cooler out the way, I then decided to unscrew the motherboard out of the case, and I really wanted to get the motherboard out just so that I can give the motherboard a bit of a deep clean and a bit of restoration, just to see if I can hopefully get it working. I knew the PSU was bad and gone, but at least I'm hoping that the motherboard would work out for me and it will still operate as intended. Now I wasn't exactly too sure what was on that cooling fin. It was dust combined with something else, and even the PCIe slots had dust in it, the RAM stick slots had dust in it. It was just dust galore everywhere, so that really needs to be cleaned. The one thing I didn't like about the design of this Antec case is actually you need to remove the motherboard in order to take out the SSD, and it was a Kingston 120GB SSD, which is okay, but it's not going to fetch a huge amount on the second-hand market. So now it was time to give the motherboard a bit of a deep clean. What I like to use is a paintbrush and just brush down the whole motherboard and just loosen all of that dust on the motherboard itself, cleaning down the PCIe slots, the RAM stick slots, working my way around the motherboard, and eventually what I would do as well is I would turn the motherboard around and clean the back as well. I removed the heatsink and just to check what condition that thermal compound was in, and as I expected, it was completely solid and was not moving at all. So what I usually like to use is a plastic scraper. Works really well with removing old thermal compound, so I used the plastic scraper to clean that off. The next thing I did was I removed the VRM heatsink, and I had to replace thermal pads, so they needed to go and get replaced with some new ones. Again, brushing down the heatsink really well between the fins, all around the fins, And then finally, what I usually do after I've given it a bit of a brush down on the back and the front is I would use my air compressor to really blow any residual dust off of the motherboard, off of the heat sinks, and that would give it a really nice clean finish. Now it was time to put both of the heat sinks back, and it was just a case of screwing them back on with the original screws that were already on the motherboard. And the other thing that I did was I cleaned down the CPU with a tissue, and again, you need to make sure there's no lint on there, and any hard thermal compound I used a screwdriver, but I scraped that off very gently. I found out this was an i7-3820 clocked in at 3.6 gigahertz, which is an okay CPU. It's not too bad, but it can't be overclocked. So I was quite happy with that overall, and generally that would be worth about £20. Now it was a case of rescrewing the other heatsink back onto the back of the motherboard, and I always like to do a grid pattern when I screw anything back on. So now that was back in place, I reinstalled my RAM, hoping that the RAM would still be okay, and fingers crossed the RAM wasn't broken as well. Now the RAM was in place, there was one more job before I actually try and turn this motherboard on and test to see if this motherboard works with the CPU and RAM. So now it was time to test out the motherboard to see everything was working. I like to use a GPU that I know is working, so in this case I'm using an R7-240, which is a 2GB DDR3 graphics card. It's nothing special, but it works. In this case I tried to boot the motherboard on, and I was getting no post blank screen. In this image you can see I don't have the cooler hooked up, but I did try it with it on. And I found out that actually the cooler was faulty, and when I shook the cooler I could hear liquid sloshing around in there. So what I had to do was I rebuilt the I/O cooler, and I've actually got a full video for how you can rebuild an I/O cooler by taking it apart and refilling it with some fresh new liquid. And once that's done, I managed to actually get the motherboard to post, but I was stuck on the boot loop screen. So I was on the boot screen of the Gigabyte motherboard, but whenever I pressed the delete, the F12, any other key, nothing would respond, nothing would work at all. And so that was frustrating after fixing this I/O cooler. So after fixing the I/O cooler, I then had to desolder the BIOS chip and use this BIOS chip reflash USB stick. I reflashed it, soldered it back in, and the BIOS was working and the motherboard was all fixed. So all in all, the 3 graphics cards probably worth about £10 each, so about £30 all for the graphics card. £30 for the SSD and the hard drive. The actual hard drive was 3 terabytes, so I think that's probably worth about £20, and the SSD about £10. The I/O cooler, maybe I'll get about £15 a second-hand market, as it isn't too kind on used I/O coolers. Now for the motherboard, because I managed to repair it, I should be able to get about £150 just for the motherboard itself, and for the CPU I should be looking around about £25 for the CPU. Finally, I didn't include the cost of the case, so the case I possibly could get about £30 if I give it a good deep clean. And finally the RAM sticks, I should be able to get an extra £30, so overall £310. What a result. Now for a bit of a laugh, I thought I would just give a bit of a benchmark with using those 3 GT730s. I couldn't get them to work in SLI unfortunately, but I managed to get one of the GPUs to work, and I got an impressive 12 FPS per second, medium settings on 1080p, which isn't going to break any benchmarks anytime soon. Now make sure you like and subscribe. At the time of recording I only have about 30 subscribers, so it would really help me out, and in my next video I'm going to use some of these parts to build a new PC. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.